Hey everyone, it's Night Haro here, and today I have my Dragon Knight tank build guide for you. So as always, everything's timestamped down below, so feel free to go ahead and skip around. We're going to start off here. I'm going to explain kind of why you might want to play a Dragon Knight tank, the pros and the cons, then we'll talk about skills, and then we'll go into the rest of the build. So why would you want to play a Dragon Knight tank? Well, the short answer is they offer multiple buffs that are unique to Dragon Knights. You can't really get anywhere else in the game. And so that's really important that you have either a DK or somebody else who has those. But even some of the buffs, only a DK can bring. So Stagger, when you're talking about Stone Giant, only a DK can do that. You could have your Zenkosh do it, but generally speaking, a lot of times a tank is doing that. The other one is Minor Brutality from our Mountain's Blessing passive. This gives you 10% increased weapon damage. You can get a similar buff, but a magic equivalent from a Templar. So usually you want one of these in the group, but those are the only two places you can get this minor buff that gives you increased weapon or spell damage respectively. So that's something, again, you can't get anywhere else in the game. The other reason is Igneous Weapons. Igneous Weapons provides both major brutality and major sorcery, and is a great source of that for everybody in your group. If you want to either save a buck on using expensive potions, or if you want to go a little bit more sweaty and run heroism potions. With the current Arcanist meta where half the group or all the group is Arcanist, that's less useful for optimized groups, but it's still really good for the average group. Other reasons you want to run a DK tank is because they are by far like the gold standard for tanking, and they have been for a long time. And the reason for that is because they have a huge toolkit. They have a Magicka costing chain ability, which is amazing. If you try to chain a target that you can't chain in, it actually refunds you the Magicka cost. Anybody who's tried to chain in CC immune targets knows it's really frustrating and really expensive. So that's awesome. They also have a really nice missile shield, so that works great on Zamaja, which is one of those fights that can be really tricky and difficult on certain classes and then easier on others. The fact that they have a class shield is also really nice. Classes, generally speaking, with a class shield are usually better than those without it, just because it's a little bit extra health if you're worried about a huge hit, and it's really great for absorbing damage over time. In short, they're just kind of the jack of all trades, and really not just like a jack of all trades that can kind of barely do what they need to do. They actually do it quite well with their toolkit they have. So anyways, with that, let's go ahead and get into it and talk about some of these skills. So first up on our bar, this is going to be an ulti generating spot. Something like Low Slash from the Sword and Board skill line is a great idea. It also applies Minor Maim, which reduces a target's damage done by 5%. Now there are a lot of other sources for Minor Maim in the game, so depending on what kind of group you're in, if you're in a dungeon, this would make a little bit more sense if the boss was hitting really hard, or if you just want to generate a little bit ultimate by way of minor heroism here. If not, you could swap this out. This can just be a flex spot in general. If you are a little bit more advanced and you want to do something to generate a little bit more ultimate, actually quite a bit more ultimate, you can go with something like Exhilarating Drain. Exhilarating Drain is from the Vampire skill line, so do keep that in mind. But what this does is you kind of reach out your hand and you drain from the target, and you gain 5 ultimate per second while channeling. You actually get 1 right at the beginning, so it's actually 20 ultimate over the 3 seconds, but it's a huge drain and it provides a ton of ultimate to your group. You do need to keep in mind this is a channeled ability, so you have to be very careful about where you use this. I don't recommend it for a beginning player, even though the ultimate generation is nice. If you get hit while you're channeling, you can get one shot. So keep in mind it will heal you for a percentage of your missing health while you're channeling, so that allows you to actually channel in a lot of situations. If you have a healer where you might not think it would be a good idea, but it actually works quite well. And again, the ulti generation is huge on it. After that, we have our class heal. We're going to go with Green Dragon's Blood. Now, in the past, there has been situations, I think Hyper pointed this out, where like you actually might want to use in a very optimized group, use the other morph of this skill. They have changed it, and I think honestly, either way is still fine, but I would personally go with Green Dragon's Blood. Now, the trick with this skill is that it heals you more based on your missing health. So with a DK and really any class with a shield, usually you find yourself hitting your shield much more often than your heal. And reasons for that are numerous. Basically, I want to say all the classes, most of the classes at least, certainly with Templars and with DKs, you actually want to use your shield for other reasons than just providing you with a shield. So on our DK, it'll actually provide us with a bit of ultimate regeneration. We can get that once every 6 seconds, which works out conveniently with the timing. And so you'll just tend to use your shield in most situations, but if you need a heal, Green Dragon's Blood is the way to go. I would typically wait till you're under about 50% health if you can before you use it, but definitely don't wait too long and end up dead, So it's kind of a tricky thing. You'll get used to it after a while. After that, we have our Taunt. So if you're going with a Sword and Board, you just want to stick with Pierce Armor. and that provides both major and minor breach, which is really nice. If you want to double ice staff tank, that is definitely a lot harder. The problem with double ice staff tanking is there's no way to get back stamina by heavy attacking, because both your staffs are going to provide you with magicka. Well, on a DK, we have some passives and some other abilities that allow us to get back stamina without heavy attacking. And that is again with our class shield, which we'll talk about in just a second. So for that reason, DKs are a little bit easier and a little bit safer to double ice staff tank on, certainly easier than a Necromancer. Necromancer being by far the hardest class to do that on. So keep that in mind. If you want to try out double ice staff tanking, these are the kind of reasons why DK is like the gold standard for tanking, because they just have a great tool for every job. If you are not going to run Pierce Armor, again, I typically use Frost Clinch. That might change in the near future. I have had some tanks tell me that, Frost Clinch causes problems. Taunt just in general right now is not in a good spot. I recently did a video providing some feedback for the developers who seemed a bit confused on what the issue was with taunt and what the issue was with the community. So I don't know, hopefully they'll get it settled out, but Frost Clinch still works pretty well as any taunt does right now, unfortunately. All right, after that, our class shield, Igneous Shield. So from this skill, by our passives, we actually get back ultimate, or we generate ultimate rather, whenever we use this once every 6 seconds. So typically that's a good idea to keep that up. There are other skills in this class skill line. If you're staggering, for example, that will also generate that ultimate. Any skill from the skill line will do that, but just keep that in mind. That's a great ulti generating source, although it's not something I would be entirely worried about, especially when you're new. Just don't worry about it. Forget about it if you're new, but it is something nice to keep up. Another thing about this, it also provides us with major mending, which is really nice because it increases our heals. So typically on a DK, what you want to do is be using your shield quite often, and then if you get chunked down, that minor mending, you shield and then you heal for a really big burst heal. So that is kind of the strength of DK, is when you get into that oh no, I'm about to die territory, popping Green Dragon's Blood actually works quite well. If you want to play it safe and feel very comfortable and have your health maxed out, it doesn't work as well. But again, that's why we use our shield kind of early and often. The other thing about our shield, it also applies to our allies around us. I believe it's up to 4. And if you're in a dungeon, or if you're in some sort of situation where even just a little bit of healing might help, or a little bit of shielding might help your party, you absolutely can keep people alive. And it's one reason you overuse this skill, because you're actually providing a shield for the DPS and those around you. Igneous is really just a great skill, and it's something you want to use early and often. Another great thing about the shield is that anytime we use an Earth and Heart ability, we restore a little over 1,000 stamina. So this is a magicka costing ability, unlike Stagger, which is a stamina costing one. So what we can use is our shield to generate stamina back. We can trade magicka, a lot of magicka, given, but for a little bit of stamina back, and that can really help you stay alive. Places where this can be really useful is any place where we're getting a channeled heavy attack, so like Rakat and V-Maw. If you're in Zalvaka in Veteran Rockgrove, or the Warrior, he has a channeled heavy attack. All those places, it can make sense to use your shield to get back stamina because you're getting hit a lot. The various cats in Sunspire, there's a lot of places where this can come in handy, and if you're running a double ice staff tank, you can use this to get back stamina, which is why, again, it's safer to run it on them. Can't say enough about Igneous. If you just kind of use it early and often, don't spam it every GCD unless you just absolutely have to, but using it early and often is a great idea on a Dragon Knight. After that, we have another flex spot here. I recommend, generally speaking, especially if you're new, running Flare. Flare provides us with major protection, which reduces our damage taken by 10%. That's pretty huge. There are other sources of major protection, but honestly, Flare is by far the best one. You don't need to morph this skill. You can just use the base morph, and you never cast it. You just leave it on your bar. You don't want to cast it. You just leave it on your bar for the passive, increase 10% damage reduction. Now, if you don't need the extra damage reduction, and you're not worried about having another skill that you need to cast, or it's a flex spot or whatever, you could put something else here. Obviously, the DK chain is a great way to go. Having a magicka chain is amazing. And again, it refunding magicka is also really nice. So if a target is CC immune. So a lot of times in trash and stuff like that, obviously you're not getting hit that hard in trash. And so putting your chain here might make sense. Remember again, your bars, where you put the individual skill on your particular bar is up to you. Whatever makes best sense for you. However, keeping it on one bar versus the other, there are a lot of reasons. Typically, a lot of people feel like 2-bar builds and the whole 2-bar thing is more complicated than it is. It turns out, usually you try to put all your buff sets and buff abilities on your back bar, and then you put all your frequently cast ones on your front bar. So you might switch to your back bar, you cast a skill that lasts 30 seconds, cast a skill that lasts 20 or 24 seconds, and then you bar swap back onto your front bar, and those are the skills you're using much more often. And so that can, every 6 seconds with our shield at least, that kind of thing. So just kind of realize how that goes. Sometimes I'll see tanks that'll put something that shouldn't belong on the front bar. It has like a 25-second duration and there's no reason to cast it early, and they'll put it on their front bar so they remember to cast it. I strongly recommend just kind of learn to bar swap, cast it on your back bar, and then spend most of your time on your front bar, which is your damage mitigation bar, which is why we have Flare here, because we're going to be spending hopefully about 70%, if not more, of our time on our front bar. After that, we have our ultimate. Typically what I run here is something like Reviving Barrier. We're running it just for the passive, just by being on our bar, just like actually Flare. Both of those skills each will give us 10% increased magicka recovery from the passives in the PvP skill line. That's really nice just for some passive recovery. And then if we ever do need to hit it, if there's like an oh no moment where we want to really help the group out, or the group's about to die, healer went down or something, don't be afraid to use Barrier. The other thing is that because of DK passives, actually from the Earth and Heart skill line, whenever we use an ultimate, we gain back a ton of magicka and stamina. We basically just like fill up all of our bars, okay, whenever we cast an ultimate. So if you are in a situation where you're about to die because you're out of stamina, you're out of magicka, this has happened to me in Cloud Rest, in Portals, you can just pop any ultimate, and the passives, as long as you have it slotted, which you should, will give you back a ton of resources, and it will save the day. Just getting back the resources will save the day, and then of course the ultimate, here or there, how well it works, depending on what the situation is. Now after that, another option here would be running Precognition. Or I'm sorry, Precognition is the other more if you want to run Temporal Guard. Just having this another one, just putting it on our bar will give us minor protection, which reduces our damage taken by another 5%. So we can get major protection from Flare and then minor protection from Temporal Guard. Now, oftentimes we don't need this, and that's why I wouldn't say slot this all the time. But if you're in a really hard-hitting fight, places where you're taking a lot of damage over time, for those who don't know, it cannot be blocked. It has to be just mitigated. And as a DK, we don't really have a lot of sources for minor protection. Some classes do, some classes don't. A DK happens to be one that does not, so that's why we might want to use it more often. After that, moving on to our back bar. First up is going to be our Wall of Elements. Wall of Elements should pretty much never leave your bar. There is one skill from every skill line that will keep up your enchantments, even when you're on a different bar. And for a Destruction Staff, that is Wall of Elements. So we want to use this to keep our back bar Crusher enchant down on our opponent at all times, especially the main target. And that will make sure that its resistances are fully brought down to 0 so that our DPS can do maximum damage, because the quicker something dies, the easier it is on you as a tank, and the easier it is on you, your entire group, because the less mechanics you have to do. DPS is king in ESO, for those who might not know that. All right, after that, we have another flex spot here. I often like to run something like Resolving Vigor. Resolving Vigor provides us with minor resolve. The thing is, we often get that from our healer. If we're getting hit by combat prayer at all, which we should be in most situations, we will already be getting minor resolve. There are certain fights where you're a little bit weird and spot and out of group, something like Teleria in Veteran Dreadcell Reef, or if you're in a pug dungeon or just not running with a healer, then this could be really important to have. It's also a nice heal over time to have on a DK, because as we mentioned, our Green Dragon's Blood is really when we get kind of under 50% health, is really kind of that sweet spot for that. So what you can do is keep up, this only lasts for 4 seconds, so it's not very long, but you can try to keep up Vigor to help keep yourself topped up with your shield kind of mixed in there. Another really good option here is Cinderstorm. Cinderstorm is a crazy heal. It's really odd that it works so well on a DK tank, but with cost reduction, this costs like nothing, right? Literally a free cast on this ability, and it will heal us for a little bit under 2,000 health per second whenever we're fully buffed and everything else. So this is another way that with our shield, and then we keep this down, it has a fairly long duration, we can help keep ourselves topped up, and we don't actually have to use our coagulating blood very often, since it is a fairly expensive skill to use. So Cinderstorm, great skill, highly recommend it. If you don't need an extra heal or something like that, you could throw something else here instead. Another kind of really good but also kind of odd heal is Burning Embers. This is another skill that's meant to be on a DPS, but if you're in an optimized, particularly an optimized raid group, and you have all those buffs and everything else, the value on it is actually going to be decently high for you. It lasts for a very long time and will provide us with about 2,000 heals per 2 seconds. It ticks every 2 seconds. Not a huge amount of heals, but if you're in a very mobile fight or maybe you have multiple targets you can dot up, this is a good skill to use so that you can help yourself with a bit extra healing over time. And it will also help us proc the combustion passive as well, because it guarantees to apply a burning in that first tick. After that, we have our range taunt on our back bar. So if we are running sword and board on our front bar, you always want and need a range taunt, and never ever, please never put it on your front bar unless you're running a 1-bar build. Just please don't do that. You don't need to. If you're running double eye staff, you would put it on your front bar. We talked about that already. You just swap it in and use that instead. But if you're running both a sword and board and a ranged taunt, I've seen tanks with both of them on there. Please don't do that. I strongly would encourage you to put it in the same spot on your back bar, and that way you're always hitting your taunt whenever you're trying to hit your taunt. It might be the wrong one, but hopefully it's the one you need. And if worst case scenario, you try to pierce armor a target that's not in range and you realize it and you have to bar swap, right? And if they're close to you, using a ranged taunt is totally okay. It'll still work to keep them taunted. So that's what you put here. Now, if you are double eye staff tanking, this is kind of a standard setup on all tanks. Instead, what you want to run is elemental susceptibility. And the reason for that is because one of the main reasons for running double eye staffs is to be able to keep up minor brittle, and elemental susceptibility will do that. Now, another reason to run elemental susceptibility is because once every 7.5 seconds, it will proc 3 status effects, and one of those is burning. And burning now in update 41 with our combustion passive will give us back 1,000 magicka and 1,000 stamina. So this is a way of just keeping that, and it can proc every 3 seconds, I'm sorry. So this is a way of keeping that up quite often just by having one skill on our bar. It also provides us with major breach to the one target we apply it on, and we can apply it to multiple targets. So this works really well in boss fights. If you're in trash fights and you need to apply this debuff in an AoE, I would probably recommend going with something else. We'll talk about Razor Caltrops a little bit later. You could also have some buffs in your groups, but in general, elemental susceptibility is a really great skill, and it's really great to be able to keep that combustion passive procced. Now, if you are still running sword and board, you might consider still running elemental susceptibility on your back bar because of the combustion passive and because how well it works. There are other things you can do to help keep this skill procced, but this does it passively. It lasts for 30 seconds, and it does a really good job. It doesn't keep it procced as much as it could, but it keeps it procced quite often. So consider that, and consider putting it somewhere else on your bar, even if you're running even if you're running sword and board and not double eye staff. And this is a skill from the Destruction Staff skill line, so that's why we would have to have it in our back bar if we were running sword and board on our front. After that, we have a source of major resolve. All tanks, the basic tanking, and honestly, any kind of DPS, one of your first survival things you want to think about is having major resolve. And that's what we're going to get here. So we have a couple of options. I personally really like Hardened Armor. Hardened Armor has gotten some buffs. All of kind of the class sources of major resolve have gotten buffs in the past year or so. And what this does, it actually provides you, whenever you first cast it, with a pretty good size shield. This can be really helpful in places like Zamaja with her heavy attack. You need to kind of shield through that. And you can use this with Igneous. And honestly, there are other skills you could use, but just that is kind of enough. Provides you with a huge amount of heals, even if you're locked out of your front bar. And just in general, it's just a nice kind of bonus thing to have. Now, if you are in a situation where things are just different, right? There's a couple of fights, you just need a bunch of magicka. Usually you're doing kind of support things and you're not primarily tanking in those situations, but you might need to cast Cleanse a lot on the chickens in Veteran Halls of Fabrication, for example. That's the first boss. People call them the chickens. But Negatrix and Positrix, something like that, where you're having to cast Cleanse a lot, which costs a ton of magicka, then you can use something like Balance from the Mage's Guild skill line. So this has a really nice duration for a major resolve buff. And then the other thing is that it doesn't cost anything. So it costs health, but generally speaking, you're getting healed so much that the cost is negligible. And then it does give you a little bit of a healing and a shield debuff for a few seconds. So you don't want to cast Balance when you're taking a bunch of damage or about to die or something. That's not a good idea, but it has a long enough duration. You can kind of pick good times to cast it. And then not only does it not cost magicka, it gives you back a bunch of magicka. So the swing on that is huge. It's like 5,000 magicka or something, or at least 4,000. It's quite a bit. So it might even be 6, but it's a lot of swing if you switch from Hardened Armor to this. But if you're having to cast this a lot and then purge and then this, it does make sense to use it. And there can be other places as well. After that, we have Igneous Weapon. weapons. A lot of times a tank can be required or asked to run igneous weapons. And the reason for that is we've kind of already talked about it. It's the major brutality, major sorcery for your group, either because, you know, maybe they want to run trash pots because you're kind of farming something and everybody's being a little cheap or whatever. Usually now with Arcanists have all these buffs provided for them. They're a little broken in that way, so they don't need it, but other classes might. And so you might be asked to still run igneous weapons in certain situations. It lasts like 60 seconds, maybe even a few more. Crazy long duration. So, you know, it's something that's very easy to keep up, and throw it on your back bar. Casting it once every minute or so is pretty easy to do for even for kind of a beginner tank. Other than that, you might want to run something else here. Again, a reminder, most of these flex spots here, I actually highlight the ones. These are all flex spots that you can put anything here that you might need to. And then there are other flex spots where there's something below it, but you want to taunt in the taunt spot, right? You don't necessarily want to swap that out. But in general, most of these flex spots, anything you need to put in here, the useful skills over to the side. And I can't possibly cover every skill in the game in one of these videos. There might be some other skill you want to work in here, but another option is Overflowing Altar. Overflowing Altar just provides a synergy for your targets, for all your allies. Whenever they get to low health, they can heal them for up to 65% of their total health. And if it crits, it'll give them a full health bar. So pretty crazy, really useful if you're running in dungeons and 4-mans, you have a fake healer or no healer or something like that. And, you know, you always want this down in a group. Although often I will tell you that a healer can and probably should be running Overflowing Altar so that you can use the synergy. And it's not just for the other DPS, it's for you as well. And if you cast this, you can't use your own synergy. After that, we have our ultimate. So of course, Aggressive Warhorn is the go-to for any kind of optimized group. But another thing here is Magma Shell. Magma Shell is like the most broken ultimate in the game for survival for tanks. So this gives you 12 seconds of basically invulnerability. There's a few mechanics in the game that will still kill you through this, but it reduces your damage taken to a very small percentage of your max health. And it does some fire damage as well, but that's not really the important thing. The main thing is it basically makes you unkillable. You can things that would one-shot you will do very little damage to you. And this is how you can kind of cheese. And in sweatier groups, this is kind of how they like only run one tank in places where you otherwise would absolutely need 2 tanks. And the thing is that if this ever drops off for even a second, you're going to die immediately. So you have to have a ton of ulti generation. You also might run something like Elfbane. Elfbane is a set that increases the duration of all fire abilities, and this is a fire ability. So to actually go from 12 seconds to 17 seconds, give you an extra 5 seconds to get that ultimate back. Generally speaking, if you want to kind of perma mag shell, if you want to do that kind of thing, if you run in and cast this, and then you have a healer or another tank in Pillager's Prophet, that gives back a ton of ultimate to everybody in the group. I think you could even wear Pillager's Prophet, actually. And that'll give you a bunch of ultimate back. And then if you're using something like Vampiric Drain, because you can do that because you're not going to die. So you can channel, but you're taking so little damage that you're not going to die. And you'll get back enough ultimate, you can cast it again before the duration is up. So that's kind of like, if you want to run around almost perma magma shelling, you do need to be a little bit organized with your group. It does make it hard to keep up any buffs or anything else, but you can do that on a DK. So just know about that. If you're in a trash pool where you keep dying, the one right before Basai and Veteran Rockgrove, or the one before Teleria in Dreadcell Reef or something like that, don't be afraid. You want to talk to your raid lead, right? They might want to teach you how to do it without having to magma shell. But if your group's struggling and just trying to get through something, or if you're about to die in an intense situation, popping magma shell is a great idea, and it's a great way to like save your life, and therefore save your group's life and help you get through content. Now again, it only lasts 12 seconds, so burn baby burn. You better have some DPS, better have Pillager's Prophet if you need to cast it again. So just keep that in mind. But honestly, pretty great skill here, and something that you shouldn't be afraid or ashamed of using. Again, talk to your raid lead. A lot of times, like if you're in my raids, I can teach you how to do everything without needing this skill. And so I would want to do that. But again, if you're with your friends and you're just trying to get through content, don't be, no one's too good for any skill. People are weird about stuff like that. It's a great skill. Totally feel free to use it. All right. After that, we have some of our flex spots, some of our more useful skills. Again, there's never enough room on these cards. I try to put as much info as I can. There's never enough room. First up is going to be Deep Breath. Deep Breath is one of, I think, 2 AoE interrupts in the game, and that can be really nice in certain situations. So leveling, this is a morph, so morph to deep breath. Definitely have this where you can flex it in. Veteran Maw of Lorkosh is one of the main places you might want to use it on the flesh renders. It's a magicka costing skill, and sometimes bashing continually just costs too much stam, so it's nice to be able to work this in. It can also provide you with a bit of a heal, so if you're in like an AoE trash situation, if you're running in a dungeon from point A to point B, just pulling everything in between, you can also use it as a pretty decent heal during those situations. After that, we have Engulfing Flames. So this has just been changed recently so that it's a little bit harder to get the full benefit. But the reason you might want to run this skill, it's less useful now, honestly. This is kind of more like me telling you this might come back in vogue at some point, right? It provides up to 6% increase fire damage taken to opponents that you apply it to. And this can be really useful for a tank to be able to apply because it's not quite as good as some of the other DPSing abilities. But again, in general, if you're running a bunch of DKs in your group, you probably will have one of them run it, but just realize it might be something that you're asked to have, and it might come back in vogue, in the near future. So keep it in mind, probably level it up. It's nice to have. The other morph of this, I will note, also applies Major Breach in an AoE. You can use something like Caltrops, Razor Caltrops, we'll talk about in a second, but you could also use the other morphs. So both morphs of this are actually very useful, and they're in your class skill line, which is kind of fun, and it's fun breathing fire as a Dragon Knight, right? So you might want to use it just for that reason. After that is Protective Plate. So this ability has very unique situations where you want to use it, but it reduces your damage taken by 50% from missile attacks. So there's only a handful of places you want to use it, but in those places, it's like totally broken. It works so well. So the first one that comes to mind is Rakat in Maw of Lorkosh. He does this channeled attack where he shoots a bunch of balls at you, and then it's like, it sounds like a machine gun to me. So when that comes out, those are all missile attacks. So when you pop this ability before that attack or while it's happening, it'll reduce all their damage to half, and it makes them tickle like a feather. It makes them so easy. Reducing the damage in half is just crazy. Similarly, the heavy attack from Zamaja in Veteran Cloud Rest, that is also a missile attack, so it works really well there. The Ash Titan to keep yourself alive, although I would typically recommend using our Ice Wall of Elements to provide a missile shield for us and our allies in that situation, so we can kind of help the group a bit more since they're also getting hit by missiles, and we're going to be fine no matter what, but they might die. So that's another place, though, you might want to use it. But any place where you have a missile attack, Protective Plate is a great skill to have, so I would level it up and have it as an option on your bar. Beneath that, we have Defensive Stance. So Defensive Stance is used just as a passive. It provides us with a 10% increase in block damage that we can block. It also provides us with a 10% reduction in cost on our block. So this is a skill you would put, it's a sword and board skill, so you put it on your sword and board bar, on your front bar, and you kind of use it there as a passive whenever you're using that. I would typically, so probably on this bar setup here, I would put it in the one spot if you're just going full survivability with flare still on our bar. I wouldn't use this without flare because flare is generally speaking just better. So keep that in mind though, if you're going full survivability. There's very few places where you really need to do that right now, but it's still not a bad skill to have. The other use for this is the Reflect Missile is used for range tanking Locustes and Veteran Sunspire. There's not really any other place it's used, but you can actually reflect back the breath attack, or I'm sorry, the shooting ice ball that it spits out at you from the dragon, and you can actually get like a 25-30k parse in like optimized groups because it damages the dragon as it reflects. There's really not really other places that you can use that I can think off the top of my head. Some places like Cloud Rest, you can't actually reflect her heavy attack, so do keep that in mind. So some places you would think it would work and it doesn't. The other morph, Absorb Missile, I don't really think you need to use this on a DK, but you could use it in Cloud Rest. It's a stamina costing shield. I typically don't recommend those on any tanks, so maybe I just take that part back. After that, we have Talons. Choking Talons will provide AoE minor maim to our targets, which reduces their damage done by 5%. This will work, it's the same debuff that we get from our low slash, but it works in an AoE. The other really nice thing about this is it roots targets in place, and it does a little bit of damage. But the main place you want to use this is in the first boss in Veteran Maw of Lorkosh. All those cats, and really throughout Maw of Lorkosh, those cats can't be taunted bonded, but they can be CC'd. So what you can do is root them in place so that they can't go to the back and chew on a healer or chew on a DPS or something like that. It's also useful in trash pools, mostly in dungeons, because in trials, a lot of the targets are CC immune. But in dungeons, it can be really useful. PvP. It's a nice skill to have and something I would definitely level up and have on my bar, or have as a flex spot. After that, we have our Razor Caltrops. Razor Caltrops is a way of applying Major Breach. Really good in dungeons. Again, if we don't want to use our Dragon Breath or something else like that, then Razor Caltrops is the way to go. It also has a really nice giant AoE on it, so that's another reason why it can be really nice to use this skill. After that, we have Stone Giant. Stone Giant provides Stagger. Stagger is this weird, unique buff that I wish they would do something with, but they haven't. And it increases DPS for our entire group. I believe Nephis at ESO University, he did some math on this like years ago at this point, and I think it was about 25k total group DPS if you kept all 3 stacks of Stagger up by using Stone Giant. So you might be asked to run this as a tank, and as you get kind of more advanced, it's a good idea to learn how to use. Now you might have a Zenkosh using it off and on to keep up that buff, so you might not need to run it in that case. But if you are running it, I just need to keep in mind that the first cast of it, where you kind of like stomp the ground, kind of like your shield, but it's like the left foot, I think. Whenever you stomp the ground, that drops block. So you want to be very careful. That's why it's not a beginner thing. And it also costs stamina. So you don't want to drop block and get one-shotted by a heavy attack. And then you also don't want to cast it so much that you run out of stamina and then you die to a hit that you can't block because you don't have enough stamina. So keep that in mind. That's why using Stone Giant is kind of a more advanced thing. All right, I think that's it for skills. So many here. There are always more skills and more things you can talk about. If you want to check out my ultimate tanking guide, I go more in depth into a lot of this stuff. But let's go ahead and move on and we'll talk about gear. So first up, our basic sets that we want to use. So for main tank, I recommend Saxhleel, Turning Tide, and then either Nazare, or if we don't have a Zenkosh in the group, then I recommend running Tremor Scale as your monster set. Those are all pretty easy to get sets. Tremor Scale drops from Volenfell. Nazare is a little bit harder to get. That actually drops in the same place that you would get Turning Tide. So Shipwright's Regret, and then Saxhleel drops from drops from Rockgrove, and you do not need to run Veteran to get the perfected Saxhleel. That's typically what I recommend for a main tank setup. Your raid lead might have like something a little bit different, but usually these kind of 5 or 6 sets here that I'm recommending are what you'll be asked to run in most situations. For off tanking, I usually have my off tanks in Pearlescent Ward, and then Powerful Assault, and then either Nazare if I don't have it on the main tank, or kind of flex to whatever they need. Sometimes Kratos is used. Kratos isn't really nearly as helpful as it used to be, but the damage reduction can be helpful in certain fights still. The damage increase on fire damage, since we're not running that many DKs, usually isn't that big of a deal, but whatever your raid lead asks you to run. Baron Zadras is a really good like ulti generating set that you can also run. So again, it's just whatever you'd like to run or whatever your raid lead would like to ask you. Engine Guardian, if you're having problems with sustain, Engine Guardian is the way to go for monster sets. And I've got an unkillable guide for tanking that kind of shows you how to change stuff around to be maximally survivable. But sometimes you might have Pearlescent Ward on your main tank or Saxhleel on your off tank. It's whatever your raid lead asks for, but this is just what I recommend. And then let's talk about how we trade all this stuff out. I will note, if you're wearing, so we're going to talk about what to wear on your body, like for traits and for enchants. It doesn't matter what gear you're wearing on your body, you still use the same traits. So if I have Pearlescent Ward body, if I have Saxhleel body, if I have Turning Tide body, I will still run the same traits on whatever set that happens to be. So just realize these two things are decoupled. One thing kind of doesn't really, it's kind of weird, but one thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. So you can make all of your jewelry with the same traits, all of your armor with the same traits, and it doesn't matter what set it is. You want the traits for other reasons, not based on the set. With everything in ESO, basically. There's a few exceptions, not tank related, but generally speaking, that's how it works. Now, for our body, I personally recommend just running all reinforced. Just make it easy. Reinforced is the best bang for your buck for any trait. Now, on a couple of pieces, like your belt and your gloves, your resistances on those pieces is really low to begin with, and so running reinforced doesn't really do a whole lot for you. I don't think it's that big a deal. I still would probably, just on my DK, would probably still run all reinforced for reasons we'll talk about in a second. If not, you could run a couple of pieces of sturdy on your belt and your gloves for a little bit of block reduction. I know a lot of people recommend divines. I've talked about that in my ultimate tanking guide. Divines gives you this tiny bit of magicka, and I don't think it's enough for anybody who's not like getting world records, it doesn't matter. It's like one skill cast every 20 minutes. It's not that bad, but it's very little bit of magicka that you actually get back from running divines. And I would personally just recommend running mostly reinforced and maybe throwing a few pieces of sturdy, and the reason for that is sturdy will give you a 4% block cost reduction no matter what piece it's on, whereas reinforced increases the resistances, and certain pieces have more than others. So that's why the difference there. And then for our weapons on your front bar, as we mentioned, moving forward, we're going to have some source of poison or fire damage. I think we already have it in our skills here, but if we don't, then you might want to put a poison or a fire enchant on our front bar. Running infused is always a good idea because it can keep up our weapon enchant no matter what it is. You could run like a shielding enchant that gives you a shield every 6 seconds if it's infused. And it's a choose your own adventure. I would go out there. I cover that stuff more in detail in that ultimate tanking guide. So it's whatever you'd like to run here. Whatever makes the most sense. There's not really a wrong answer. On our back bar, however, we definitely want to be running an infused crusher enchant. So we want an infused staff, two-handed weapon with a crusher enchant, because our group will be relying on us to provide that debuff on our target. And then for jewelry, I've gone back and forth on this. Harmony is really good. Harmony is also a really good trait, but Harmony requires synergies. And with so many Arcanists in group, sometimes you don't have as many synergies as you'd like. Having to beg and like panic, I need a synergy. In new groups, you're not going to be getting it as often as you would like. So there's reasons you might use it too often, and then it's a 20-second cooldown per synergy. So if you're spamming too much, you might be full on resources and then not have enough. So I'm back to recommending just infused on all three. When you get later on and things are more optimal and you're, a better tank or whatever, then running something like Harmony, I think could make sense. I have pieces of Harmony. I swap them in. It's also really cheap to do once you play later on in the game. It's very cheap and easy for you to swap out those pieces of jewelry. But in general, I would just run 3 pieces of infused with reduced cost. Typically all 3 reduce magicka cost on a DK. Although you could use some like reduced tri-stat, which reduce stamina, magicka, and health cost. Other notes here for your jewelry, having a few pieces of swift jewelry is always a really nice thing to have as a tank, particularly in trash. And, there are other traits too that can potentially have some benefit, but this is personally what I would recommend. After that, it's CP. So for a blue CP, I never take off my bar Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve, and Ironclad. Those, taking direct damage, that's a heavy attack. That's important to reduce the damage on. Taking single target attacks, that's generally a heavy attack as well. So it's important to reduce that damage. And then damage over time. There's not too many ways to reduce the damage taken from damage over time. And so the CP is a good way to go. After that, if you need resistances, then you're going to run Bulwark. If you don't need resistances, then I'd probably go with Unassailable. There's just not a whole lot of else good in this tree. Unassailable reduces our damage taken from AoE damage. The thing is that most AoE damage isn't designed to hurt tanks. It's designed to hurt DPS. And so it's low enough that it's threatening to DPS, but it's not really threatening to a tank. So that's why we often don't need this, but there are some exceptions. And so it could be a nice to have, but it's kind of a flex spot there. On our red CP, I recommend Shield Master. So any class with a shield, there's several CP that are really nice. One of them is Shield Master and the other one is Ward Master. So Ward Master is the one I really like. Shield Master is good. And if you want to run something like, there are other shield CP that you could also slot here. This is just what I recommend. If you need resistances though, I wouldn't run Shield Master. I don't think it's quite good enough. I would instead run Fortified. Fortified will give you increased armor, which is basically both kinds of resistances. After that, Celerity is really nice. It gives us 10% increased speed in combat. It's surprising how often being faster as a tank can be life-saving and can be really helpful. So I really like Celerity. But again, the red tree in general is choose your own adventure. If you can, use Fortify to get to max resistances. Other than that, Celerity, Expert Evasion, I never take off my bar, a free roll dodge every 30 seconds. can't beat it. And then Wardmaster. On a DK, I wouldn't take Wardmaster off my bar, actually, or off my CP tree. So Wardmaster, Expert Evasion wouldn't take off. If you need resistances, go with Fortified, and then everything else is kind of a flex spot. So it's up to you. We'll choose your own adventure. Other CP that people like, Sustained by Suffering, Rejuvenation, there's plenty of them out there, but this is just what I particularly like. I will note, and I talked about this again in my other guides, but the Ultimate Guide, I really strongly do not recommend running Bracing Anchor. Bracing Anchor is needed in like 2 or 3 fights. The fights with really heavy hitting, channeled heavy attacks by the boss, so Zalvaka, the Warrior, and Rakat, those are like the 3 places that I would, maybe there might be one other, but in general, you don't need it, and it slows you down, and being slower so often, most people don't switch your CP at all. Being slow all the time can kill you more often than missing some damage mitigation that you don't need. So just keep that in mind. After that, I usually put 64 points in health. And then for our jewelry enchants, I didn't talk about it on our body, on our body enchants, on our armor. I recommend you can either go with all tri-stat if you are just rich, or you could go with tri-stat on the big pieces like your chest, your head, your boots, maybe your legs or something. Or what I personally do, because it's so expensive for those tri-stat enchants now, is that I swap them up. One will be health, one will be mag, one will be stam, and I just go for a 1/3 kind of division there. But you usually want to make sure your stamina pool is higher than anything else. So putting 64 points in health is just the easy way to go. You want to aim on a DK for about 41k health is a pretty good spot. If you're doing hard modes, sometimes going up to like 45, 46k is a good way to go. Certain fights you actually want lower health, like Cloud Rest, in, certain fights like Basai, you actually want lower health. So do keep that in mind. Even on the hard modes, you want even lower health. So certain fights, the damage scales off your max health. So in those fights, you want lower health for various reasons, or if there's a heal check or something else. So, but in general, 64 points in health is totally fine. And then just mess with your enchantments as you need to. And then the Atrodonk Mundus is the way to go. It just provides us with extra magic recovery, so we can cast more skills and more abilities. You can also use, there's Munduses that will increase your resistances. Again, if you're following this build guide, I don't think you need that, but just know that it's out there, it's available. 33k, a little over, is basically the resistance cap, so keep that in mind. And then after that, we have a race. So on race for a DK specifically, okay, we're talking about just DKs with all of this stuff. I think a Nord is a good way to go. If you become a Nord, then it frees up both of your CP spots. You won't need Bulwark or Fortified. You won't need either one of those. So that frees up your CP. However, and it gives you a little bit of ulti generation. However, if you want pure sustain and recovery, going with an Imperial is probably one of your best bets. Imperial has a 6% cost reduction to everything. That includes ultimate. So it kind of does give us the equivalent of ulti in that way, because it makes our ultimate 6% cheaper to cast, but it also gives us a 6% reduced cost in casting spells. That is the equivalent of about 150 to 240 magicka per second, depending on what kind of skill we're casting. I'm kind of lowballing it at the 140 because most spells cost at least 2,500. Some of them, many of them as a tank, cost 4,000 or close to it. So we are going to run, reduce cost on our jewelry, so that will reduce it some, but at least 150 magicka. And keep in mind, that's 300 recovery, because recovery normally takes every 2 seconds. So the number you see on recovery is actually every 2 seconds. So if you want to convert that, either half that or double this number. So that's a huge amount that you can get on an Imperial. And it doesn't matter if you're casting magicka or stamina costing abilities. So an Imperial could be a really good choice there. Something like a Breton could also be a really good choice. They have reduced cost and increased magicka recovery, so that could also be a good idea to run a Breton, so you have plenty of magicka back. And I've recommended like running a Red Guard on a Necro, because you need that stamina back. But as we've mentioned, there's multiple ways of getting back stamina even while holding block on a DK. And so I don't think stamina is as big of a concern. So going with something like a Breton will actually allow us to cast more abilities. Now, if we do that, we do want to slot both Fortified and Unassailable, and Bulwark, so that we get to resistance cap with all reinforced gear. So, it's a choose your own adventure. You can run whatever you want. Argonian, there's not really a lot to recommend in Argonian, but the fact that when you drink a potion, you get more magic and stamina back is still a nice to have. It's not as good as the other races, but play what you want. It's not really that big of a deal. I have tanked hard mode Dreadcell Reef, at least part of it on an Argonian Nightblade. Okay. Is it the best thing to do? No. Is it good and fun and does it work? Yeah, it can. It's hard. It's hard to do, but you can. And so just keep that in mind. Okay. Don't let anybody tell you have to play a Nord. You absolutely don't have to. After that, for food, again, this is DK specific. I would recommend Orzaga's Red Frothgar. It gives us max health and it gives us Magicka recovery, which is what we really want. We want a lot of Magicka recovery on our DK. You could also use something like Jewels of Misrule, gives us max health, and then it gives us both magic and stamina recovery. Again, we need less stamina recovery on our DK typically, and whenever you're holding block, you're not recovering stamina anyways, so that's why I like the Orzagas. But again, you can, it's very easy to switch in between these two. And then after that, I think we're done. Man, that's a lot of stuff. Hopefully this was good DK specific advice for you. I'll be going through all of the classes and eventually we'll be circling around and doing some more easier beginner guides for you. But I appreciate everybody watching. Let me know if you have any questions or if I missed anything down in the comments. I'll be happy to answer, or come by the That Wasn't the Boss Discord. We have help channels there. People are really nice. If you want to make some kind of weird build, or if you're experimenting or something, come by. We have people that are very experienced. They can tell you the sweatiest meta thing to do for score pushing. But if you're like, hey, I want to make a fun build using X or Y, we also, they'll help you out with that too. And no one's going to be like, you can't do that. That's not meta, right? So it's chill. It's laid back. Sometimes there are problems in those channels, but I promise I will drop the ban hammer on anybody who causes problems. So it's a safe place if you have questions. A lot of times I get DMs. I'm more than happy to answer them, but sometimes it's more than I can answer myself. So that's what it's there for. Anyways, that's it for today. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.